We're going to continue our lecture. We covered atheism and humanism on Monday. That video is online. Today, we're going to dive into secularism. Sorry, I can't resist. So let me begin with what secularism actually means, because it's often misunderstood. At its heart, secularism is the principle that separates religious institutions from state governance. But it's more nuanced than simply keeping religion out of politics. Secularism operates on several levels. First, it ensures religious neutrality in public institutions. This means that government bodies, public schools, courts, and other state apparatuses don't favor one religion over another, or religion over non-religion. The state maintains a impartial stance. Second, and this is crucial, secularism protects a dual freedom. It protects religious freedom, your right to practice your faith, worship as you choose, live according to your religious convictions, but it also protects freedom from religious imposition, ensuring that no one can force their religious beliefs on others through the mechanisms of state power. Finally, secularism promotes equality, regardless of religious belief, whether you're a Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, atheist, or anything else. Secularism says you have an equal standing as a citizen. Your rights don't depend on your faith or lack thereof. So we need to go over some of the historical context of how secularism emerged. To truly understand secularism, we need to understand where it came from, and the story begins in Europe's darkest chapters. Secularism didn't emerge from abstract philosophical debates in peaceful libraries. It was forged in blood and fire, born from Europe's catastrophic religious wars. From roughly the 1520s to the mid-1600s, Europe tore itself apart over religious differences. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of Western Christianity. The result was devastating. The French Wars of Religion in the late 1500s saw Catholics and Huguenots, which were Protestant, slaughtering each other for decades. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 devastated Central Europe. In some regions, lost up to half of their population. These weren't just battles between armies. Entire communities were massacred because they held the wrong theological positions about communion or the authority of the Pope. Neighbors turned on neighbors, families were divided, cities were burned, all in the name of religious truth. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, represented a turning point. European leaders began to realize that trying to enforce religious uniformity through state power was not only immoral, but also impractical and destructive. The question became, how can people, different faiths, coexist peacefully within the same order? This historical trauma created the conditions for secularism. Thinkers began asking whether the state needed to enforce religious conformity at all, or whether it might function better to remain neutral in matters of faith. The alternative, continued religious warfare, which had proven utterly catastrophic. The second major influence on secularism came from the Enlightenment, the remarkable intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries. Two strands of thought were particularly important. Humanism, what we might call rational skepticism, which included atheistic perspectives. Enlightenment humanism placed human beings rather than divine authority at the center of moral and thinking. Humanists argued that we could derive ethical principles and organize society based on human reason, human needs, and human dignity, without necessarily grounding everything in religious doctrine. This didn't mean rejecting religion entirely, but it did mean recognizing that all or that religious authority shouldn't be the sole or primary basis for political legitimacy. Some Enlightenment thinkers went further, developing explicitly atheistic or materialistic philosophies. They argued that religious claims could be verified through reason and evidence, and that societies could function perfectly well, perhaps better, without religious foundations. While these atheistic perspectives remain controversial and minority positions, they contributed to the broader questioning of religion's proper role in public life. The key Enlightenment contribution to secularism was this: the idea that legitimate government derives its authority from rational principles and the consent of the governed, not from divine right or religious doctrine. Individual liberty, including liberty of conscience, became a foundational value. What emerged from these historical experiences and philosophical developments was a set of core principles. First, individual liberty. If religious wars taught Europe anything, it was forcing conformity of belief is both morally wrong and socially destructive. People must be free to follow their own conscience in matters of faith. This liberty extends both to believers and to non-believers. Second, rational governance. The state should make decisions based on reason, evidence, and public benefit, not on sectarian religious doctrines that not all citizens share. This doesn't mean ignoring religious perspectives in public debate, but it means that public policy needs justification that can appeal to citizens across religious lines. Third, protection from oppression. Secularism developed as a direct response to the oppression that results when religious authorities control state power or when the state enforces religious conformity. Whether it was the Spanish Inquisition, the persecution of religious minorities, or forced conversions, history showed that merging religious and political power often led to tyranny. So why does this matter today? You might be thinking this is all very historical, but what does it mean for us today? Secularism remains deeply relevant because the tensions it addresses haven't disappeared. Around the world, we still see conflicts over the proper relationship between religion and state. We see debates about religious symbols in public spaces, about religious exemptions from generally applicable laws, about the role of faith in shaping public policy on issues from education to healthcare to human rights. Understanding secularism, its origins in religious violence, its philosophical foundations in Enlightenment, its commitment to protecting both religious freedom and preventing religious imposition, helps us navigate these contemporary challenges. It reminds us that secularism isn't about hostility to religion, but about creating space for people of all faiths and those of none can coexist as equals. The principles that have emerged from Europe's darkest period that state that the state should remain neutral in religious matters while protecting everyone's freedom of conscience remains one of humanity's most important political innovations. Now we want to get into some of the intellectual roots of secularism. Now that we understand the context from which secularism emerged, let's examine specific thinkers who gave intellectual form. These weren't just abstract theorists, they were people responding to religious violence and intolerance they witnessed around them, trying to imagine a better way forward. So first, we have John Locke. So one of the first major figures is John Locke, the English philosopher who lived from 1632 to 1704. Locke is sometimes called the father of liberalism, and his contribution to secular thought cannot be overstated. Locke lived through England's own religious conflicts. He witnessed the English Civil War, which had significant religious dimensions, and he lived in exile in Holland during the periods of political and religious persecution. These experiences profoundly shaped his thinking. Locke's great contribution began with his letter concerning toleration, written in 1689. This wasn't just a political treatise, it was a passionate moral argument. Locke argued that religious tolerance wasn't simply pragmatic or convenient, it was a fundamental requirement of both Christian charity and rational government. His reasoning was elegant. True religious belief, Locke argued, must be sincere and voluntary. You cannot force someone to genuinely believe something. You can only force them to pretend. Therefore, state coercion in matters of religion is not only morally wrong, but also practically pointless. It produces hypocrisy, not genuine faith. Moreover, Locke argued that civil government and religious authority have entirely different domains and purposes. The magistrate's power, he said, extends only to protect life, liberty, and property, what he called civil interests. The magistrate has no jurisdiction over the salvation of souls, which belongs to the realm of personal conscience and voluntary religious communities. This led Locke to develop what we now call the concept of separation of church and state. He measured a clear boundary. Churches should be voluntary associations, free to establish their own doctrines and practices, while the state should concern itself with solely with the civil affairs, maintaining peace, protecting property, and ensuring justice. This was revolutionary. Remember, in Locke's time, most European nations had established churches, and religious dissent was often a crime. Locke was saying that this entire arrangement was fundamentally mistaken. At the heart of Locke's thought was a profound commitment to individual religious liberty. Each person, he argued, has an inalienable right to worship according to their own conscience. The state has no business interfering with this right, provided that religious practice doesn't threaten civil peace or violate others' rights. Now, I should note that Locke's tolerance had limits. He didn't extend it to Catholics, whom he viewed as owing allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope, or to atheists whom he believed couldn't be trusted to keep oaths. These exclusions show the historical limitations of even progressive thinkers, but the principle he established that religious liberty is a natural right would eventually be extended far beyond what Locke imagined himself. Finally, Locke promoted what we might call a rational approach to religious belief. In his work, The Reasonableness of Christianity, he argued that religious faith should be compatible with reason. While faith might go beyond reason in some matters, it should never contradict reason. This helped establish the idea that religious belief should be examined critically and not simply accepted on authority. Now let's turn to Francois Marie Arendt, better known as the pen name Voltaire. I'd rather say Voltaire than his French name anyway. If Locke laid the philosophical foundation for religious tolerance, Voltaire was its most passionate and eloquent advocate, living from 1694 to 1778. Voltaire was a French Enlightenment writer, historian, and philosopher who used wit, satire, and moral outrage to attack religious tolerance or intolerance. Voltaire's approach was much more confrontational than Locke's. He launched a systematic critique of organized religion, particularly the Catholic Church's role in French society. His target wasn't faith itself. Voltaire was a deist who believed in God, but rather the institutional power of religious authorities and dogmatism they enforced. He witnessed numerous cases of religious persecution. The case that most moved him was that of Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant in Toulouse, who was falsely accused of murdering his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Calas was tortured and executed in 1762. Voltaire worked tirelessly to clear Calas's name and hold his persecutors accountable, turning the case into a cause célèbre that exposed the injustice of religious fanaticism. This case inspired Voltaire's Treatise on Tolerance, in which he asked, "What is tolerance? It is the prerogative of humanity. We are all full of weakness and errors. Let us mutually pardon each other of our follies. It is the first law of nature." Voltaire's famous declaration, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," though possibly apocryphal, captures his spirit perfectly. He argued that a society must protect the rights of those with whom it disagrees, including religious minorities and dissenters. He took particular aim at religious persecution, writing, "It is clear that every private individual who persecutes a man, his brother, he is because he is not of the same opinion, is a monster." Strong words, but Voltaire had seen the consequences of intolerance firsthand. Voltaire's satire was devastating. In works like Candide, he mocked religious hypocrisy and the blind acceptance of religious authority. He challenged the idea that religious texts should be accepted uncritically, and he ridiculed the notion that priests had special access to truth. His phrase, "Écrasez l'infamie," crush the infamous thing, became a battle cry against what he saw as religious superstition, fanaticism, and abuse of religious authority. He believed that religious dogmatism kept people in ignorance and was used to justify terrible cruelty. Voltaire was a great popularizer of scientific thinking. He championed Newton's physics and Locke's philosophy in France, arguing that knowledge should be based on observation and reason rather than revelation and authority. He believed that as people became more educated and rational, religious fanaticism would naturally decline. He wrote, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." This linked irrational belief directly to moral harm, the cornerstone of his argument for why society needed to embrace reason over dogma. Then we have Baron de Montesquieu. So our third key thinker, his name was actually Charles Louis de Secondant, but he was the Baron of Montesquieu, who lived from 1689 to 1755. While Locke and Voltaire focused on religious tolerance, Montesquieu's contribution to secularism was more structural. He helped design the governmental framework that would make secularism practically achievable. So it should be noted that Montesquieu, a lot of his ideas were the foundations of what our Constitution became in the years after 1776. Montesquieu had a lot of influence on the founders of the United States. So Montesquieu's masterwork, The Spirit of Laws, was published in 1748, which introduced the theory of separation of powers that would become fundamental to modern democracy. He argued that governmental power should be divided among different branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each checking and balancing the others. Why does this matter for secularism? Because concentration of power, whether monarch or a religious authority, it inevitably leads to tyranny. By distributing power among different institutions within different functions, Montesquieu created a framework where no single entity, including religious institutions, can dominate the government. This structural approach addressed a practical problem. Even if you convince people that church and state should be separate, how do you actually organize government to maintain that separation? Montesquieu's answer was that you build checks and balances into the system itself. Montesquieu also pioneered what we might call political sociology. He studied how different societies organize themselves and how climate, geography, commerce, and culture shaped their institutions. This comparative approach revealed that there was no single God-ordained form of government. Different societies develop different systems based on their circumstances. This relativistic perspective undermined claims of divine authority for political arrangements. If governmental forms varied based on practical circumstances rather than religious truth, then political legitimacy must come from something other than religious doctrine. Montesquieu advocated for what we would now call evidence-based governance. He believed that political systems should be designed rationally, taking into account human nature, social conditions, and practical experience. Laws should serve human welfare and justice, not enforce religious orthodoxy. He wrote that moderate governments, those that respected liberty and were constrained by the law, were superior to despotic ones, regardless of the religious character of either. Good government, in other words, was about structure and principle, not about religious conformity. Now let's move from theory to practice. How do these ideas actually transform societies? Let's examine the key historical moments when secular principles were implemented into real political systems. So first you have the French Revolution, which began in 1789. This represented the most dramatic and explicit attempt to separate church and state. The revolutionaries didn't just want to limit church power, they wanted to fundamentally restructure the relationship between religion and public life. Under the Ancien regime, the Catholic Church was integral to the French government and society. It owned vast amount of land, collected tithes, controlled education, and had its own legal system. The clergy formed one of the three estates in the Estates General. The revolution changed this radically and rapidly. In 1789, the National Assembly nationalized church property. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy made priests state employees and required them to swear loyalty to the state. Many refused, creating a schism that would haunt France for generations. The revolution went further. Revolutionary leaders attempted to de-Christianize France, closing churches, removing religious symbols, and even creating a new calendar that eliminated Christian references. They established a cult of reason and later the cult of the supreme being as alternatives to Catholicism. This radical approach had mixed results. While it established the principle that the state need not be tied to any religion, the violence and extremism of de-Christianization created a backlash. Napoleon eventually negotiated a concordat with the Pope in 1801, restoring some church authority while maintaining state supremacy. The French experience taught an important lesson. There's a difference between separation of church and state and hostility to religion. The most successful secular systems will learn to separate institutional authority while respecting religious freedom. Nevertheless, France's commitment to laicity, in particular, a particular version of secularism, remains strong today, emphasizing not just separation, but also keeping religion out of the public sphere more thoroughly than other democracies. Then you have the United States with its constitution. While France's approach was revolutionary and dramatic, the United States took a different path, institutionalizing secularism through constitutional design from the beginning. The First Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1791, contains just 16 words on religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or protecting or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Establishment Clause embodies a distinctly American approach to secularism. It prohibits the federal government from establishing an official religion or preferring one religion over others. But notice what it doesn't do. It doesn't create a hostile relationship between government and religion. The very same sentence protects the free exercise of religion. The founders, many influenced by Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, recognized the dangers of established religion. They had seen religious establishments in Europe and even some in American colonies where dissenters faced discrimination or persecution. They knew America's religious diversity, Congregationalists in New England, Anglicans in the South, Catholics in Maryland, Quakers in Pennsylvania, and many others, made a national religious establishment impractical. Thomas Jefferson famously described the Establishment Clause as creating a wall of separation between church and state. James Madison, the amendment's primary author, had fought against religious establishments in Virginia and believed that religion flourished best when government didn't interfere. What's remarkable about the American approach is how it's evolved through interpretation. The Supreme Court has gradually applied the Establishment Clause more broadly, striking down state-sponsored prayer in schools, prohibiting religious displays on government property in some contexts, and preventing government funding of religious institutions with some exceptions. At the same time, the court has protected religious freedom, allowing religious groups to organize, religious individuals to express their beliefs publicly, and religious organizations to operate schools and hospitals. The American model tries to walk a line: government neutrality toward religion, but not hostility, protection of religious practice, not religious privilege. Beyond these dramatic examples, the 19th and 20th century saw a gradual, often peaceful dismantling of state-sponsored religious institutions across the Western world. In Britain, the slow process of removing religious restrictions began with the Catholic Emancipation in 1829, allowing Catholics to serve in Parliament. The religious test requirements for university admission and government office were gradually eliminated throughout the 19th century, while the Church of England remains established and its actual power has dramatically declined. Across Scandinavia, state Lutheran churches have been gradually separated from government, with Norway completing the process as recently as 2012. These cases show that secularism needed to be revolutionary or hostile. It can happen incrementally as societies recognize that religious establishment has become incompatible with pluralism and equality. Even in countries that maintain formal religious establishments, the practical reality has become increasingly secular. The established church functions more as a cultural tradition than as an instrument of state power. All these developments contributed to what we now recognize as modern democratic governance. Several principles became standard. Political legitimacy arises from popular sovereignty, not divine right. Leaders are accountable to citizens, not to religious authorities. Citizenship is universal and equal, regardless of religious belief. You don't need to be a member of an established religion to have full civil rights. Law is based on rational public purposes, not on enforcing religious doctrine. While religious citizens can certainly bring their value to political debate, laws must be justified in terms accessible to all citizens. An individual conscience is protected. The state cannot compel religious belief or practice, nor can it punish religious dissent, but within the limits of public safety and others' rights. These principles, which we now take for granted in many democracies, represent the practical implementation of secular ideas between Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and others. Types of secularism. First, you have institutional secularism. This is the most concrete and legally defined form of secularism. It's about the formal structures of government and how they relate to religious organizations. At its core, institutional secularism means that religious institutions and government institutions are legally separate entities within their distinct spheres of authority. The church, and I'm using church here as shorthand for any religious organization, doesn't run the government, and the government doesn't run the church. What does this look like in practice? It means that religious leaders don't automatically hold governmental office. Bishops don't sit in parliament by virtue of their religious position. If they're there, it's because they were elected or appointed through the same process as anyone else. Conversely, government officials don't appoint religious leaders or determine religious doctrine. This separation extends to organizational independence. Religious institutions operate as private organizations, determining their own membership, beliefs, and practices without government interference. They can own property, manage their affairs, and organize themselves according to their own principles. The state recognizes their existence and protects their autonomy, but doesn't direct their activities. Similarly, the government operates independently of religious authority. When Parliament passes a law, when a court renders judgment, when an executive agency implements policy, they do so on their own authority, not because a religious institution has sanctioned their actions. The government doesn't need approval from religious authorities to function. Now, I want to emphasize something important here. Legal separation does not mean hermeneutic isolation. Religious organizations can certainly comment on public policy, advocate for particular laws, and participate in democratic debate. Religious citizens can bring their faith-informed values into the political process. What institutional secularism prevents is a formal merger of religious and governmental authority, the situation where the two institutions become legally interdependent. The second element of institutional secularism is that the state itself doesn't sponsor, endorse, or promote religious activities. This is where we get into some of the most contentious practical questions. What does state-sponsored mean? It means using government resources, government authority, or the government's symbolic power to advance religious purposes. So let me give you some examples. A public school funded by taxpayers and run by the government cannot organize mandatory prayer sessions or religious worship services. That would be the state using its authority and resources to promote religion. However, students can pray individually or in groups on their own initiative. That's protected religious freedom, not state sponsorship. A courthouse cannot display religious texts or symbols of expressions of the court's own endorsement. The Ten Commandments might be displayed as a historical exhibit about the development of law, but they cannot be prominently featured as the foundation of the court's authority. That would suggest the state is endorsing a particular religious tradition. Governments cannot fund government funds generally cannot be used to support religious activities. You can't use church tax dollars to build a church or pay for a religious education. Though there are some complex exceptions and ongoing debates about this, particularly regarding school vouchers that can be used at religious schools or social services provided by religious organizations. Here's where it gets interesting. The prohibition on state sponsorship is about what the government itself does, not about preventing all religious activity in the public spaces. The city can rent out a public auditorium to a religious group on the same terms it rents it to anyone else. That's the viewpoint of neutral access. What it can't do is give special preference to religious groups or to use its own voice to promote religion. The third component that public institutions, government offices, public schools, courts, military facilities operate as neutral spaces where all citizens of faith and of none can participate equally without being subjected to religious pressure or proselytization. Think about what this means for someone walking into a government building. Whether you're a Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, or anything else, you should be able to access government services, participate in public education, or fulfill specific duties without feeling that the government is endorsing a religion you don't share or privileging those who belong to certain faiths. This is particularly important in contexts where participation is involuntary. You can choose whether to enter a church or a mosque, but you can't opt out of the court system if you're called for jury duty, or out of public education if that's your only option. Therefore, these spaces must remain neutral to respect everyone's equal standing. However, neutrality doesn't mean hostility. A public school that has a moment of silence isn't violating institutional secularism as long as that moment is genuinely neutral and students are free to pray, meditate, or simply gather their thoughts according to their own choice. What would violate it is what would violate it is if teachers led students in a particular religious prayer. Kind of a side note there as well that I think about is many schools, especially North Dakota, will have what's called the night before graduation. They'll have like a prayer service or something beforehand. A lot of some rural schools will do that. If the school were to make that mandatory for students to go to, then that would be against the rules of Constitution. But many schools give it as an option. Similarly, government employees cannot certainly be religious individuals. A judge can wear religious attire or jewelry. A congressperson can cite religious motivations for their policy positions. What they can't do is use their official government authority to impose religious practices on others or to privilege one faith over others in official functions. The next one is philosophical secularism. This is more abstract than institutional secularism and frankly more controversial. Philosophical secularism is about how we reason, how we know things, and what counts as a valid justification for beliefs and practices or beliefs and policies. Philosophical secularism begins with an epistemological commitment, a commitment about how we acquire knowledge. It holds up that our beliefs, especially those that inform public policy, should be based on reason and evidence rather than on faith, revelation, or religious authority. Let me be clear about what this means and what it doesn't. Philosophical secularism doesn't claim that religious believers are irrational or that faith has no value. Rather, it makes a more specific claim. In the public square, when we're making decisions that affect everyone in a diverse society, we should rely on forms of reasoning and evidence that are, in principle, accessible to all citizens regardless of their religious commitments. Why? Because in a pluralistic society, people hold different, incompatible religious beliefs. What one person accepts as divine revelation, another person doesn't. If we make public policy based purely on religious claims, we should do X because my sacred text says so, or we should ban Y because it violates my religion's teachings, then we're imposing on one group's religious convictions on everyone else's. Philosophical secularism says if you want to advocate for a policy, you need to provide reasons that can convince people who don't share your religious starting points. You need to appeal to shared values, empirical evidence, logical argumentation, or public welfare considerations. Here's an example. Suppose someone opposes a particular policy because they believe it violates divine law as revealed in their scripture. That's a perfectly valid reason for them personally to oppose it. But in a philosophical secular framework, if they want to convince others and shape public policy, they need to offer other additional justifications. Perhaps the policy would have harmful social consequences or violates principles of justice that people of different faiths can recognize, or empirical evidence shows it wouldn't achieve its intended goals. This is what the philosopher John Rawls calls public reason. The idea that that political justification should be framed in terms that citizens with different comprehensive doctrines, religious or secular, could potentially accept. Connected to this philosophical secularism stance on supernatural explanations in public discourse. When we're trying to understand the natural world, develop policy, or solve problems, philosophical secularism holds that we should rely on natural rather than supernatural explanations. This doesn't mean denying that supernatural forces might exist. That's a separate metaphysical question. Rather, it means that supernatural explanations aren't useful for public policy because they're not testable. They're not falsifiable, and people disagree about them based on their different faith traditions. Finally, let's explore cultural secularism, which separates at the level of social norms, cultural practices, and everyday life, rather than at the level of institutions or epistemology. Cultural secularism refers to the degree to which religious considerations, religious identity, and religious authority influence daily life and social interactions. In highly cultural societies, religion occupies a relatively small space in public culture. It's present, but it's privatized. It's something people do in their personal lives rather than something that permeates public culture. What does this look like? In culturally secular societies, you might notice that people don't routinely discuss their religious beliefs in casual conversation. Religious affiliation isn't a major factor in social status or professional advancement. Businesses operate without regard to religious calendars beyond major holidays. Media and entertainment don't center on religious themes or assume religious literacy. This is distinct from institutional secularism, and a society can have an institutional separation of church and state while being culturally religious. Think of the United States, where the government is constitutionally secular, but religious language and symbols are common in public culture. Conversely, some European cultures maintained established churches institutionally, but are culturally quite secular with low rates of religious practice and little religious influence in daily life. I'm going to take a little break. My voice is shot. So I'm going to show the next slide. I decided to skip it in the lecture just because we did go over this a little bit in the historical evidence, just so we can continue on. I went a little bit overboard on my expansion of the lecture, so I'm trying to go through a little bit faster if I can. So yeah, that's the approaches we saw earlier. Okay, so let's go with some of the non-Western perspectives. So this is crucial because secularism is often criticized as a Western imposition, incompatible with non-Western cultures and religions. The reality is more complex. In Turkey, they offer one of the most striking examples of a non-Western secularism. When Mustafa Kemal Atatürk founded the Republic of Turkey in 1923, from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, he implemented an aggressive program of secularization modeled partly on French laicite. Ataturk abolished the Ottoman Caliphate, closed religious courts and schools, replaced Islamic law with European-style civil codes, banned religious orders, and removed Islam as the state religion from the constitution. The state took control of religious affairs through the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which managed mosques and trained imams. Religious rest was discouraged in public life. Ataturk famously promoted Western clothing and banned the fez. This was explicitly secularism from above, imposing a modernizing elite that believed Turkey could develop and compete with Western powers by reducing Islam's public role. The military saw itself as the guardian of secularism and intervened several times when it perceived threats to the secular order. Turkish secularism, or laik, represented an assertive state control rather than separation from it. The state didn't remove itself from religious affairs. It subordinated religious institutions to state authority. Mosques were government managed, religious education was state controlled, and religious expression in public life was restricted. This model achieved significant modernization and created a space for secular-minded Turks to live without religious imposition. Women gained legal rights far ahead of many Muslim majority countries, and education became scientific and secular. A vibrant secular culture flourished in many urban areas. However, Turkish secularism also generated significant tensions. Many observant Muslims felt marginalized and oppressed, unable to wear religious dress in universities or government offices, restricted in building mosques or establishing religious schools, and subject to a state-controlled version of Islam. The tension between secular and religious Turks has defined much of Turkish politics for a century. In recent decades, particularly under President Erdogan of the AKP party, Turkey has moved away from assertive secularism toward what some call conservative democracy, maintaining formal secular structures while giving religion greater public presence and influence. Whether this represents healthy evolution toward a more inclusive secularism or backsliding toward religious authoritism is hotly debated. The Turkish case illustrates both possibilities and perils of implementing secularism in Muslim majority societies. It can enable modernization and pluralism, but if imposed too aggressively from above, it can create a lasting resentment and instability. You also have a model in India, which political theorist Rajiv Bhargava calls principled distance. Indian secularism, enshrined in the Constitution, doesn't mean strict separation or state neutrality toward religion. Instead, it means that the state maintains complex, context-sensitive relationships with different religious communities, intervening sometimes to protect individual rights and promote equality. This makes sense given India's extraordinary religious diversity, roughly 80% Hindu, 14% Muslim, plus significant Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, and Jain minorities. The founders of independent India in 1947 believed that India could only survive as a unified nation if it remained secular, if no religious community dominated and all were treated with equal respect. Secularism in India has the constitution that prohibits religious discrimination and guarantees freedom of religion. There's no established religion. The state funds various religious institutions and festivals more or less equitably. Personal status laws governing marriage, divorce, and inheritance vary by religious community, with different rules for Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. The state intervenes in religious practices when necessary to uphold constitutional values. For instance, it has reformed the Hindu temple administration and banned certain discriminatory practices. And then we also have some Southeast Asia models as well, countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia, has the world's largest Muslim majority democracy, and practices what it calls Pancasila, recognition of belief in one God as a founding principle, but with protection of multiple religions: Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. It's not secular in the Western sense, but the state explicitly endorses no religious belief. It mandates religious pluralism. This reflects a pragmatic approach to managing extraordinary religious and ethnic diversity. Malaysia has a more complex system where Islam is the official religion, but other faiths are tolerated. Ethnic Malay citizens are constitutionally Muslim and subject to Islamic law in personal matters, while non-Malay citizens, primarily Chinese and Indian, follow civil law. This creates a dual legal system that balances Islamic identity with pluralism, though it generates ongoing tensions. East Asian countries present yet another pattern shaped by different religious landscapes. Japan has a weak institutional connection between Shinto and the state, The emperor has ceremonial Shinto roles, and public officials sometimes visit Shinto shrines, causing controversy. Yet, Japanese society is highly secular in practice, while religion playing a minimal role in most people's identity or behavior. Traditional practices like shrine visits are often cultural rather than religious acts. China represents an extreme case. The Communist Party enforces strict state atheism as an official ideology while allowing limited religious practice under tight state control. This isn't secularism in the liberal democratic sense. It's authoritarian suppression of religion as a competing source of authority. Yet China's approach to religion is pragmatic. Tighter control over religions seen as threatening, Islam and Xinjiang and Christianity in some contexts, and tolerance of those as seen compatible with party authority, Buddhism, and traditional folk religion. South Korea, by contrast, has a strong institutional separation of religion and state, combined with highly religious population where Christianity, Buddhism, and new religious movements all flourish. Religious organizations play major roles in civil society, while the state remains neutral. In Africa, you have Nigeria, which has a Christian majority south and a Muslim majority north. The secular federal law existing alongside the Islamic law in some northern states. This creates complex federal arrangements trying to balance different religious legal traditions. In South Africa, you have in post-apartheid constitution enshrines secular principles, equality, non-discrimination, religious freedom. Excuse me. While recognizing the role of traditional and religious law in personal matters, the challenge is implementing these principles in society where religion is extremely important to most citizens. These diverse global manifestations teach us several lessons. First, secularism is not a single Western model to be exported wholesale. It must be adapted to local contexts, histories, and challenges. And second, there are multiple viable secular arrangements from strict separation to principled pluralism to manage religious diversity. And third, secularism's success depends less on formal constitutional arrangements than on whether it actually achieves its core purposes, preventing religious domination, protecting religious freedom, and enabling diverse communities to coexist peacefully. So that's actually where I'm going to stop for today.